So as I said, I'm going to introduce Wai Tsang. This is an hour, so it's quite complex. We'll try and keep some of the questions to the end of the first half. Here you are, Wai. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. It's the first ever time in Birmingham. Most west of Manchester I've ever been in my life. I grew up in East Anglia, so this is way out for me. We'll get way out in this talk.
Andy.
Yeah, so it's 2012, and we're going to talk about something that's going to emerge in 2012. It's basically a huge gap in human understanding. And it really baffles scientists, philosophers, and theologians. It's basically the mystery of how the brain works, the mystery of consciousness, and the mystery of mind. And they're obviously all interrelated: mind, brain, consciousness. So that's what tonight's talk is going to be about. Some of you may have seen the PSTV Revolutionary Movements talk. Now, this is going to be something slightly different. If the end of that talk kind of referenced tonight's talk, the brain theory, and this kind of like paradigm shift idea, then the end of this talk, which will be more about the brain, artificial intelligence, and consciousness, will refer back to the PSTV Revolutions talk. So kind of it's going to be completely different now, generally. Here we go. That is actually my brain, taken a few years back, maybe 15 years ago. Life was really cheap, and I would do anything for money. One of those things I would do was have my brain scanned for cash. So I had that scanned for £30, and you listen to a bit of Mozart, and you press some buttons, is it joyous music, happy music, sad music, whatever, and you get 30 quid. And if you are more adventurous, you might get £200 to have a little cannula in your arm for kind of double-blind studies where they give you a drug and you don't know what it is, so you come back 3 times, you get £200. If you're really ambitious, you get about £3,000 to £5,000 if you stay a few nights, sign a waiver form saying they're going to put a spinal tap in your back 3 times, and there's 1 in 1,000 chance you're going to be paralysed from the waist down, but you waive right to sue them, and you get about £5 for 3 days' work. Now, I never did that. Okay, I never did that. I mean, a friend of mine did. He's dead, for reasons, but he's a reckless guy. A bit dark humour there. I mean, so I used to live a kind of different life many years ago. Anyway, so that's my brain, and when I first saw these photographs in the email, the JPEG email, I mean, the hairs on the back of my neck just went up. I mean, after studying brain for so many years, actually seeing a scan of your own brain, it was like a religious feeling, kind of straight up. What we're going to introduce tonight is a way of looking at the brain that's really actually quite simple. The brain's the most complex object in the universe. I mean, 100 billion neurons, hundreds of trillions of synapses, 100,000 kilometers of wiring in the brain, unbelievable complexity. But we're going to show an incredible simplicity in the course of the first hour that's going to make you look at the brain in a completely different way. And this idea is something that's really current in artificial intelligence and also in science today. It's the idea of fractals. The idea is a fractal. So we're going to talk about the Fractal Brain Theory for 2012. Now let me explain preliminaries. What is a fractal? Okay, this is necessary to understand the rest of the talk. Now you see, okay, just a bit of preliminaries. I mean, this is basic O-level maths. To show my age now, you see, O-levels, GCSE kind of maths. That's a basic shape. That's shaped like a brain, but it could be any shape. And you take that shape, if I move it over there, that's called translation symmetry. It's the same shape, but it's symmetrical to that original shape. Now I can translate it down there, I can rotate it. It's still the same shape, just translated and rotated. And I can move it down there and reflect it. And I can combine transformations. So I'll move it over there, scaled it. And here I've rotated it and scaled it. So that's symmetry. So these shapes are symmetrical to that shape. Now self-similarity is when you take the original shape, you make a smaller copy of itself, and then you put it inside itself. And recursivity is when you keep doing that process. So that's basically self-similarity and recursivity. You can see it's slightly more complex looking. It's actually really simple. So basically the original shape made into smaller copies inside itself, and recursivity is that you keep continuing that process to infinity, potentially. And so these smaller shapes are said to be nested within the mother shape. So that's self-similarity, recursivity. Just to reinforce the point, say your classic Russian dolls are nested, but in a very kind of a single doll manner. So we've got a slight variation here of your fractally nested Russian dolls. This is kind of like the mother, the biggest Russian doll. And in this diagram, basically, just zooming into that one here, you can see the same thing again. I'm zooming into that one. You can zoom into any of those, and it can go off to infinity. So that's the basic idea. You see, it's actually, even though that looks really complex, it's actually really, really simple. It's the basic idea that the brain is also likewise fractally organised. Okay, so now we're going to fractally decompose the brain and show why this is the case. So this is really actually cutting-edge neuroscience and cutting-edge way of looking at the brain. There's another example of a mathematical fractal. See, the same principle, and again, same principle, same principle. So it's actually very, very simple what fractal means. So that's another one. Now, just some preliminaries. I mean, that's your standard view of the brain. Now, it's impossible to give a talk about the brain without just going through a kind of overview of what the brain is and what it looks like and how it's connected. Okay, so just a bit of introduction to the brain. Now, most of your brain is basically what you see there, which is the cerebral cortex, and that's about 80% of the mass of the brain. So it's like, now interestingly, okay, that's the brain kind of split down the middle, so you're kind of looking from the inside out, down the middle. Now, this crinkly mass that's most of your brain is actually a flat sheet. You strip out all the white matter and you flatten it out, it's like a handkerchief, it's actually literally flat. Now, if you see that's drawn to scale, if that's your side of your head, you have this massive, massive, almost like blanket, this big, kind of scrunched up into the side of your head, 1 foot each side of your head. So that's quite amazing, isn't it? This huge mass of flat sheet just scrunched in there. Now, the amazing thing is, this cerebral cortex has the same basic design all through it. And what it is, it's basically, okay, there's another picture of a flattened cortex, that's actually a monkey brain. The point I had to make was basically the cortex is divided into these different areas, and different areas do different things, like a patchwork quilt, so different functions. That's visual cortex, primary visual cortex, that does moving arms and legs about, that's processing hearing, etc. And the same for a human brain, the numbers correspond to the monkey brain. Now, there's an incredible design of the cerebral cortex. Now, basically, the entire cerebral cortex is made up of cortical columns, about maybe 0.3 millimeters wide, very small. But these columns are basically the basic building block of your entire cerebral cortex. Now, the interesting thing is that a mouse cerebral cortex, a mouse brain, a tiny sliver of mouse brain, is actually made of the same building block. It's incredible. Roughly the same diameter, containing roughly the same number of neurons, and as we go through the architecture of the cerebral cortical column, there's a basic design of each column containing about 500 to 1,000 neurons. So these are some of the neurons marked out. These are some of the cell bodies of the neurons. These are some of the fibers. And it's arranged in a very stereotypical 6-layer arrangement all throughout the brain, 6 layers of cerebral cortex in your cortical columns. And this is another view. Even though it's roughly the same architecture, different parts of the brain will have variations. So, I mean, that's primary motor cortex. So these layer 5 cells are slightly bigger and fatter. And in your kind of more primary sensory cortices, layer 4 will be more pronounced, like here, called the granule layer. But the point is, the same basic design has been preserved from a mouse brain to a human brain, and the same basic architecture is used throughout the cortex. That's remarkable. And this is just a view on some of the neuron types in a column, just separating out individual neurons. So this is a basic design of a tiny little column that makes up this flat sheet where most of your mental life goes on. Now, other thing I have to explain is that these patches, they represent things topographically, which means that, say, the visual cortex will actually take the input from your retina, and the spatial relationships of points of light on your retina are preserved on the visual cortex. So, like, if you have a little picture on your retina for your lens of your eye, then that little picture is projected on the back of your brain in the visual cortex. So that's called a topographical map. And so there's an example of what a human being is seeing, and that's the back of the visual cortex, and that's lighting up correspondingly. This is the point where I kind of alienate sections of the audience completely, and I completely lose them. I've made a good start, and I've kind of lost those people. Ghastly experiment. Okay, basically, a monkey, visual cortex, monkey gets to look at that, gets injected with a radioactive tracer, and monkey gets sacrificed, and basically the pattern it sees, basically the pattern on the visual cortex. Move quickly along. So topographic maps. Okay, so basically what you see with your eyes is projected to your, your flat sheet cortex topographically or retinotopically in this case. And the same for the ears. I mean, say you're hi-fi, you have what's called a kind of frequency analysis. So, you know, the bass notes make all the kind of, on the right side of the spectral analyzer, your EQ jump up and down, and then suddenly you get a soprano singing, and suddenly the high notes go up on the right side. Now the ear does the same thing, it does a frequency analysis, and that frequency analysis, that picture of the sound is projected to your primary auditory cortex. So same idea. So it's a topographic tonotopic. And the same idea for your smarter sensory cortex. So two different points on your skin will be on adjacent points in your kind of smarter sensory cortex, processing touch. And the same with the musculature as well. So you get the idea. So it's kind of processing pictures, kind of visual processing. Now, you see here, so that's where the toes are, represented in your primary sensory cortex, and that's your genitals, you see. And that's the reason why toe sucking is erogenous. So there you go, that's the oldest trick in the book in public speaking, just stick in some gratuitous sex to perk up the audience. Okay. Anyway, okay. So back to the flattened monkey brain, and now all that deals with vision. All the coloured areas deal with vision, and everything you see in the monkey brain has corresponding parts in the human brain. Now these numbers were made 100 years ago just through microscope, looking at differences in architecture, slight variations, and this guy called Brodmann marked out about 50 areas in a human and monkey brain. Now with modern research, we've further subdivided those areas into about 500 different little patches, but the same principle applies. You've got a patchwork quilt of different little functional areas of topographic maps, so you're processing things visually. Okay, just to continue this introduction. Now, these patches of, that's a primary visual cortex, where your eyes go into the primary visual cortex. And then the primary visual cortex feeds into the secondary visual cortex, and the tertiary and quaternary, etc. It's basically a hierarchy. So basically, there's your eyes, goes into your visual cortex, and it's a hierarchy. It goes up and up and up and up and up. And it ends up in the part of your brain called the hippocampus. That's the hippocampus right there. And in the monkey diagram, that's the hippocampus. So it's like a hierarchy, so it funnels in the information in a hierarchy and ends up in the hippocampus. Now if you lose your hippocampus, then you can't form new memories. So you can lose a sliver of neurons called a CA1 region in your hippocampus, and you can do the same crossword puzzle again and again, meet the same person again and again, and you will not remember things anymore. But it makes sense, doesn't it? If your kind of sensory data funnels into this hippocampus and you lose it, then you can't combine those sensory elements anymore, so you can't form new memories. So it makes sense. So the same with your. That's to do with touch. Your sensory, smarter sensory cortexes go to the hippocampus, and that's a diagram. That's your hippocampal complex, and these are different modes. So that's superior temporal gyrus deals with hearing, that deals with vision, that deals with touch. So you get the picture. These different modes will funnel into the hippocampus. Now, correspondingly, in the same way we have hierarchies of sensing, we also have hierarchies of doing. Now, very roughly speaking, the front part of your brain, the front part is involved with doing things. So that's your motor cortex, and that's your smarter sensory cortex, that's your visual cortex. The back part deals with sensing things, seeing, hearing, and touch. Whereas the front part deals with moving your arms and legs about, and also deals with thinking as well. And in the same way we have hierarchies, sensory hierarchies, we have hierarchies on the other side that correspond to the sensory hierarchies. And instead of different modes of sensing, we have different modes of doing. So, so for instance, in this diagram here, human brain, monkey brain, that's the primary motor cortex, and you have these separate pathways, and each one's a separate hierarchy of doing. So that's basically your speech hierarchy. So here are the kind of muscles, neurons that move the muscles in your mouth, and that makes your mouth move in ways that make sounds, speech sounds. And higher up the hierarchy makes sounds of words, and then higher up the hierarchy sentences, and then sentences that convey meaning. So you get a picture. And likewise, in the primary motor cortex, you might have right at the bottom kind of little twitches. You combine those twitches into little movements. And you combine movements and behaviours, and those behaviours strung together to do things, to do tasks and realise goals. So you see, there's a very kind of like elegant picture already emerging. Now, if I cut the brain down in the middle, this is the diagram here. So basically, I've kind of sliced the brain down the middle. I'm looking on the inside surface. Now, this part deals with thinking about people, thinking about yourself, the social brain. This is really interesting because when you think about social things and people and yourself in relation to other people, this is the part of the brain that lights up. Now, they call this the default mode network because they realise that when people are not doing anything, that's the part of the brain that's active. What does that mean? It means that neuroscientists discovered daydreaming. So you're not given a specific task, you daydream. What you daydream about is about people and yourself in relation to other people, which means plotting and scheming, which means how can I be famous, how can I be loved, how can I get to that person's underwear, how can I do my enemy in. Sorry, sorry. I don't think about those things. I mean, like, I'm just speculating that other people might. Okay, so that's the default mode network and the kind of social brain. So you see, different hierarchies handle all our cognitive aspects and all the things we do and say and move and articulate, etc. So this is just a diagram of that same hierarchy. We go up the motor hierarchy, and that's the thinking part, and then there's further stages down that actually move your muscles about. Now, if the sensory hierarchy ends in your hippocampus, and if you lose your hippocampus, then you can't form new memories. Then the doing part is also a hierarchy, and the peak of the hierarchy is called the cingulate gyrus, or the cingulate cortex. And it's that, basically, slice your brain down the middle again. It's a kind of border region here. And basically, if you lose parts of your cingulate cortex, in the same way you can't form memories if you lose your hippocampus, if you lose parts of that, you can't do things. So if you lose a part called the anterior cingulate cortex, you get a condition called akinetic mutism, which means you can't move and you can't speak. Again, that makes sense. As you go up the doing hierarchy, then you lose your ability to do things. Now, a bit of detail. The hierarchies are wired up in a certain way. So I mentioned earlier that each cortical column is divided into 6 layers. So correspondingly, each patch of cortex is also correspondingly divided into 6 layers. Now each level of sensory or motor hierarchy will project to the next layer in a very stereotypical fashion. I mean here, say if that's coming from input coming from your eyes and ears, then the data will go into layer 4 specifically, always layer 4. And there's lots of processing going on, and then the information will be forwarded from layers 2 and 3 to layer 4 again. And again, from layer 2 and 3 to see a very kind of a stereotypical, almost machine-like arrangement of connections. And backwardly, you get feedback always from layer 5 to layer 1, and layer 5 to layer 1. So that's a sensory side of the hierarchy. And the motor side is almost like a mirror image. So as you go down to motor primitives, it's almost as if you do the mirror image of the sensory hierarchy. So if that's where you move your muscles and effectors, then what's happening is that you're going from 5 to 1. So it's like a mirror image. So without drowning in detail, it's basically this very stereotypical pattern of wiring. And it's very precise, very, very exact. The other thing is that each level, if that's the back posterior sensory hierarchy and that's your motor hierarchy, then the front and the back will link up with each other, but in a very stereotypical fashion, in that lower levels of the sensory hierarchy will only project to the same level of the motor hierarchy and vice versa. So as we go up the hierarchy, basically, the secondary levels will tend to project to the secondary sensory to the secondary motor. You get a picture? And the hierarchy continues even up more levels. So very, very kind of organised pattern behind the brain. These are actually specific wiring diagrams of some of the back projections to the front of the brain and vice versa. So these are actually some of those linkages in the monkey brain. Now, these are actually scans of some of these fibres in diagrammatic form. This is actually a brain scan of real fibres and real brains. That's your corpus callosum. You can see that the famous corpus callosum that links the right half of the brain to the left half of the brain. Now, many people have written copious volumes about the fact that women have more integrated brains because their corpus callosums are thicker. It's true. I mean, women have thicker corpus callosum, so theoretically the left and right hemispheres are more interconnected. But also, to complement that, in men, what I'd call longitudinal fasciculi that connect the back of the part to the front of the part are more developed than women. You can make of that what you will, you know, I don't want to cause any controversy here, but I mean, you can, you know, it's just, there are gender differences in the way brains are wired up. But it's a general thing. I mean, some women will have very wired up front to back, and some men will have very, you know, left and right integration. Okay. Now, some stunning new research. I mean, this is amazing research that came out. Neuroscience is new. I mean, all this information is brand new. I mean, most of it's only 10, 15 years old. And a result came out in 30th of March, published in Science magazine, one of the most prestigious science magazines in the world. And I came back from a long flight from Hong Kong, and I was jet lagged, and I read this thing on the internet just after it's published. And I thought, because it just totally fitted the fractal brain theory I was working on. Now what it is, it's basically, with new scanning technology, this is the most high-powered scans we have now, actually tracing individual nerve fibres in a living brain. It's amazing, isn't it? It's actually a living human brain, actually seeing the actual fibres in a living human brain. But what this paper showed, and what they found, is basically, if that's the flat sheet of your brain, then basically how the different regions are wired up, whether it's corpus callosum or front to back, or whether it's neighbouring regions, is that the wiring pattern is like a grid. So the wires, if you flatten out the sheet, the wires only go up or down, like an American street pattern. They only go left or right, up or down. It's incredible, isn't it? So they're always crisscross at right angles. You see that's an actual scan of a living brain, always cross it, and it's at all scales. So from the corpus callosum going across to what I've described, the male front to back going down, that's up and down. But at all fractal levels of scale, it's all the same. The wires are allowed to go up, they're allowed to go across, but not allowed to go diagonal. It's a staggering new find. Might not win a Nobel Prize, but it's actually a fundamental result about how the brain's wired. It just published in March this year. So I gave the same talk, you know, a few months back. It existed in the public domain. Incredible, cutting edge stuff. I mean, this really is a. But anyway, the brain theory, which I'll describe later on, will completely explain this phenomenon and will give answers that scientists have barely started asking so far. Now, the front part of your doing brain, this gets interesting now, it's how it works. The front part, your doing part, the prefrontal cortex, or thinking and moving your arms and legs about, works in conjunction with a part of the brain called a striatum, and that is the striatum. So it's really, really important. Basically, the frontal cortex doesn't work without it. Now, how it works is basically each patch or frontal cortex has its own little patch of striatum, and each patch of cortex forms like a loop with its own patch of striatum. So each of these numbers here corresponds, you see, say 46, that's a very important part of the brain. There's 46 there, look, see? So every number here you can match up to a corresponding part of striatum. And as I said, we've subdivided these 50 areas further, so these parallel pathways further subdivide fractally. And they're parallel paths, they don't really interfere with one another. This is really amazing. And now, if you imagine all the frontal cortex, okay, all the frontal cortex here, so it has its own little patch of striatum to work with to form this little loop. Now, what the frontal cortex does, it animates thoughts and it animates behaviours. So it sequences things. And it's like it needs this kind of loop to sequence things, but it kind of makes sense. It can kind of turn a handle and things animate in time. But it must have this striatum to work with. Now, if the striatum is damaged, then these loops don't work anymore. Now, very interestingly, the striatum is modulated by a chemical called dopamine. So if that's a part of your motor cortex with its corresponding patch of striatum, okay, each patch of striatum is modulated by dopamine. And if you lose that dopamine, then the striatum doesn't work. In the same way the cortex doesn't work without the striatum doesn't work without the dopamine. Now, this is the layers of your brain that move your arms and legs about, so to do with behaviour. And these are the corresponding parts of your striatum that basically allow that to happen, animate those behaviours in time. And these dopamine neurons, collectively, the region is called the substantia nigra pars compacta, and that's what goes in Parkinson's disease. So we lose these dopamine neurons that basically get Parkinson's disease. Now, a few years back, there was a designer heroin called MPTP, and it's synthetic heroin. Basically, gave you an incredible high, and unfortunately, completely wiped out your substantia nigra pars compacta. So the next day, you basically couldn't move. That's the story of the frozen addicts. So that's graphic, isn't it? Basically, you need these dopamine neurons to move about. And so the same for the rest of the hierarchy. So going further up the hierarchy, the thinking part, arranged as a hierarchy. These are separate patches. That 46 again, very important part, has its own bit of stratum to work with, and its own bit of dopamine neuron to modulate it. So in the same way, these wheels only turn if the dopamine turns. And the other thing I forgot to mention was there's a kind of cascade that these dopamine neurons make the stratum work, but then it kind of cascades downwards. So if the enclosing wheel turns, that kind of makes the inner wheel turn, and correspondingly like a cascade of dopamine. So it's very almost like machine-like, almost. Now, this dopamine section, it's famous. I mean, these dopamine neurons, ventral tegmental area, mesolimbic dopamine pathway is famous. It projects to the nucleus accumbens. It's so famous, it's even been on the cover of Time magazine. And it's famous because it's the pathway of addiction. So every single addictive drug, without fail, every single one will activate one way or another the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, this pathway here, projecting to the nucleus accumbens. So I could, just to skip on detail, but I'll dwell on drugs for a bit. I know people are interested in drugs. So cocaine will block reuptake at the axon, and amphetamine will block reuptake, but also cause the dopamine to leak out. Now ecstasy will activate this pathway because there's a serotonin pathway into the VTA, and it'll cause the serotonin to leak out and then activate very intensely the VTA. And heroin works on both sides. And again, other things like apomorphine will activate the dopamine receptors directly. So one way or another, alcohol is important because basically it disinhibits inhibition of the VTA, so it's removing inhibition. That's why you get the rush, that kind of high for alcohol. Every single addictive drug will activate the dopamine pathway. So the dopamine pathway then activates the nucleus accumbens, and then the nucleus accumbens is connected to the anterior cingulate cortex. If you lose that, you get akinetic mutism. You can't move, you can't speak. Francis Crick, the neuroscientist, biologist, DNA fame, called the anterior cingulate cortex the seat of free will. And if the seat of free will is modulated by the pathway of addiction, it kind of makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It all connects together, all these kind of like separate facts from neuroscience. Now, there's a kind of question mark here. I mean, drawn deliberately, because I'm going to answer. So, what if addictive drugs activate the VTA? Then what activates naturally the VTA, ventral tegmental area? Another diagram. So basically, I've concatenated both hierarchies. So the kind of primary motor cortices. Okay, that's the stuff you lose in Parkinson's disease. And that's your cognitive hierarchy. They kind of concatenate to one big hierarchy. Okay. So what then activates naturally your pathways of addiction? Okay, this gets more psychological and interesting now. So it kind of going into a lot of structure and connections. Now we're going into more things you can introspect and understand introspectively. Well, what activates your pathway of addictions? Okay, this makes sense. If this makes sense, is your emotion centers. So if drugs, drive us to do things for drugs, then what naturally motivates us is emotions. So our engines of motivation are emotions. So what connects the powers of the VTA is your engines of motivation. Now, the engines of motivation, this is something you learn about in biology class, hypothalamus. What you're probably not so familiar with is the amygdala, ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Now, what it is, it's basically a hierarchy again, and the hierarchy is one of evolutionary ancientness. This is very old. And then evolutionarily, you add bits, but also complexity. Now, if the hypothalamus is about motivation, it's about the most basic form of motivation you can possibly have. So it's about thirst, and it's about hunger, and it's about sex, but it's thirst in the most basic, primitive form you can possibly have it, because the hypothalamus actually detects osmotic balances between membranes, actually detects the amount of water in your blood. And it detects hunger in the most basic way, it detects the amount of glucose in your blood. So the most basic form of, kind of homeostasis, most basic functions you need to maintain, and also body temperature. So these are the most basic drives you've got to satisfy. So the hypothalamus is really old, it's really fundamental. If you lose hypothalamus, you're dead. It's 1% of your neurons, and basically, obviously, it's really, really important. Now, as you go up in evolution, your motivations become more complex. So the amygdala, say, deals with maternal behavior, really important, and also deals with if hypothalamus is just about sex and orgasm, the preoptic area, then the amygdala deals a lot with gender orientation and gender preference. So not just content to have orgasms, you want to actually have orgasm with a certain kind of person, a certain kind of sex now. It's getting more complex, evolutionarily more complex. And also the amygdala deals with pheromones, which is basically smells that activate your emotional centers directly. Now, say mouse sexual behaviour and rat sexual behaviour is all driven by pheromones. That's the reason why in a pitch black, mice and rats can, well, breed like mice and rats, to actually see each other to breed, okay? It's all completely driven by smell. People thought for a long time that humans didn't process pheromones because the vomeronasal organ, which is in animals, which does process pheromones, in a human being, it's like our tail, it's basically redundant, it doesn't work. But in other experiments, they found that human beings do process pheromones, but it's been, the function has been re-evolved. So one study showed that women, tests of sweaty t-shirts, that consistently rate sweaty t-shirts of men that were genetically different from them and had different immune systems. There's a kind of almost like a crossing over effect. And basically what they're saying is that is an inbuilt mechanism that kind of breaks social taboos of interracial marriage. That basically promotes genetic diversity. So this is a kind of drive against all kind of social norms. I mean, mother was saying to me for years, marry a nice Chinese girl, and some Jewish people here, marry a nice black girl, nice white people say, marry a nice white girl. And these are social norms that sometimes people promote, but then people just cross over and just break the rules. So mum's telling me to, you've got to marry a nice Chinese girl. That's my girlfriend, my partner's from Doncaster, and kind of British Army, County Durham mining stock, Caucasian. So I mean, this crossing over effect is real. I mean, it's basically pheromones, and they found basically that human beings process pheromones in a re-evolved organ in the nose, and it's quite smell. Well, perfume manufacturers know this, don't they? It's basically smell is really, really important. Anyway, we'll go further up the hierarchy, and basically as you go up the hierarchy, just some diagrams, just to help you visualize. That's the hypothalamus. Okay, that's a tiny little sliver of neurons in your brain, but less than 1% of mass. And that's your amygdala just in front of the hippocampus, just to help you visualize what's going on. Now, as we go up the hierarchy, we have the ventral and medial prefrontal cortex. So things are more complex now. The emotion centers process more complex things. The ventral and medial prefrontal cortex does more complex motivations now. So that's basically it's called orbital frontal cortex and ventral and medial because it's basically ventral. It's underneath. If you kind of look underneath your brain. Above your eye sockets, that's basically orbital frontal, and that's basically part of this emotion circuit. And if you slice the brain in half, then it's basically the section there, 25 bits of 32, that basically are high up the hierarchy. Now it's getting more complex. So, say in a monkey brain, it's actually processing things like complex tastes. Say something that's hardwired into your brain. It's basically fat used to be a really high reward and good thing to have because basically you needed fat because basically people starved in the past and fat was really good. Now we've got supermarkets, you get fat, fat's a problem now. But we are primed to really like fat. So that sensation of fatty ice cream, kind of buttered bread, oily pizza, oily in your mouth, you're hardwired to like that. My daughter, I mean, like she can't, constantly mad about ice cream. So it's hardwired to make her dopamine neurons really fire like crazy. So you just really have to pull away from that ice cream shop sometimes, really mad about ice cream, these kiddies, and that's the reason why it's hardwired. And also another complex pleasure is touch. So in the orbital frontal cortex, we're basically complex, stroking a rabbit, bunny rabbit, really, I don't know what to say, pussy, bunny rabbit. It's a complex pleasure. Okay, it's complex. Lowbrow. It's serious highbrow talk. Okay, touch is a really important pleasure. Okay, and also vision. Okay, vision in monkeys. Okay, vision. Okay, we've had like simple pleasures and simple detecting glucose in your blood to detect hunger. But monkeys are more discerning. So in the visual cortex of monkeys, they can actually rate ripe fruit as being more high rewarding than non-ripe fruit. That's actually quite a complex discernment. Now, as we go into human beings, the orbital frontal cortex is far more pronounced and developed. So basically all the monkey bits back here. Now as you go from the back to the front, the orbital frontal cortex, the rewards get more and more abstract and even more complex. So as we go forwards, things like money. The monkeys do attach value to money and tokens, but humans obviously have more complex discernment for money. As we go forwards, things like money and complex abstract rewards. And what's the highest reward and the highest pain? What is it? It's basically social, isn't it? So at the tip of the apex of this reward hierarchy, now the philosopher Foucault said that hell is other people. And it's true, isn't it? But so is heaven. And the worst pain is obviously, it's bereavement, isn't it? Unless you're completely autistic, or unless you're a psychopath, basically these are the worst. And also the greatest pleasures are social. So we see it as it kind of go forward into the front of the brain, then we get more and more complex pleasures. Now, because this part of the brain is right at the tip of the front of your head, it's actually prone to damage from car accidents. Because you have a car accident, you go bosh, and the brain goes forwards and it gets damaged a lot. And what they found in one study, okay, this is really controversial stuff, I'm going to lose some members of the audience here, is they found in a study of psychopaths, real incarcerated psychopaths that killed loads of people horribly and tortured them to death and stuff. Okay, they found that most of them had really bad upbringings, like Hitler, beaten by his father to a coma, and the Fractal guy, who, mother in a concentration camp, Buchenwald, and really horrible stuff goes on in their life. And become psychopaths. I know it's controversial, but these things happen. What they found was, okay, there's a group of these psychopaths that had perfect lives, really, best parents, best upbringings, really amazing lives, gifted, and gifted lives. But they found, without exception, all these people had some serious trauma, and it often was a car accident early on. And these people became psychopaths. Very controversial bit of research, I know. So basically, if you lose that front part of your brain, then you can't attach emotional rewards and aversions to people. You see them as objects. You see them as basically, something to satisfy other gratifications like sex, like money. Okay, so it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, at this point in the talk, when I'm giving this talk in London, it's degenerates into heated disputes. Oh, you fascist? No, you nurture. What are you saying? But it's controversial, I know, but I mean, it kind of makes sense. There is ability to heal and kind of recuperate, but I think if the damage is extensive, it kind of makes sense that you're going to be kind of weird, and if you lose that part of your brain. Okay, move on, because an argument starts. Okay, now the interesting thing is that these emotion centers, okay, nucleus accumbens, cingulate cortex, orbital frontal cortex, amygdala, and hypothalamus, they basically have the same striatal structure. So in the same way, all the parts of your prefrontal cortex, and this is cutting-edge research, it was controversial for years, but now it's accepted in the past maybe 5 years. Each of these parts of your emotion hierarchy, they all work with their own little bit of striatum. So in the same way, the other part of your prefrontal cortex works with the striatum, so does your emotion centers. And also in the same way, those parts of the striatum work with dopamine, so do the striatal areas of your emotion centers. In the same way, there's kind of like a dopamine cascade. There's also a dopamine cascade going through the hierarchy of your emotion centers. So it's very, very machine-like. It's a very elegant kind of pattern to the brain. The innovation I want to make, which is necessary for this fractal brain theory, and I'll show you the reason why later, is this. So this is innovative, is that basically I can place the entire emotion centers together with the rest of the frontal lobe hierarchy. I can justify it because it has the same underlying architecture, and even though it seems as if they're completely different things, emotion centers, centers of thought and centers of movement, I'm actually placing it on the same hierarchy. I can also place it on the same hierarchy because of the projection pattern, the top-down projection pattern. The high levels in hierarchy in emotion centers project from 5 to layer 1, 5 to layer 1, 5 to layer 1. So that same pattern we saw earlier is repeated throughout the hierarchy. That's another justification. But the real reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to fractalize the entire brain to a very simple theory to completely reduce it. And there's another way I'm going to show it in a minute. Why this fractalization, why this hierarchy, seeing it as one concatenated hierarchy, makes absolutely perfect sense. even though, I mean, these emotion centers are detecting inside your body glucose, detecting pheromones, detecting kind of emotional drives, the idea is that in abstract form, basically what they're all dealing with is context. They're all dealing with sensory data. So from an abstract level, you can actually view them as the same. But anyway, so what we do now is basically, with our preliminaries, we're going to completely now fractalize the show how the brain's complete one fractal. Okay, so this is what's leading up to the first section of the talk. Okay, so now back to our Russian dolls. The claim here is that the brain is also like Russian dolls. It's really simple. Okay, so the cortical column contains a typical neuron called a pyramidal neuron. So 80% of all your neurons are pyramidals, and there's a basic pattern of neurons. You have dendrites going in, flowing information into the cell body. You have axons flowing information out to neighbouring neurons. But also, stereotypically, you have a kind of looping back to the cell body area. And likewise, a cortical column will take inflow from other columns, will flow out to other columns, but also loop back to itself. And hypercolumns will do the same thing. Will take from neighbouring hypercolumns, will project out, project in, but also loop back. And even cortical patches, the same reasoning holds for cortical patches. Basically, you now go up the fractal level, an entire cortical patch will project to neighbouring cortical patches, projecting outwards. But then inwardly, kind of integrate signals like dendrites into the cortical patch, and then also a looping back. Okay, even through relay stations, but also through the dopamine striatal loops. And then as you go up the hierarchy, basically, okay, this is one patch, and this is actually one of those striatal loops modulated by dopamine, or the ventral tegmental aerial substantia nigra pars compacta. And this basically, we go up the level now, this is basically an entire processing complex of the brain. So but the same pattern of other patches with very little fractal hierarchies flowing into it. And then that will flow information out, lower down the hierarchy to other areas. And then it will loop back on itself. But then if we take the entire brain, we have exactly the same pattern. We basically have all these sensory modalities flowing into the hippocampus. Now here, each branch is not just a single dendrite or strand of nerve fibre. Each branch here is an entire mode of sensing or entire mode of doing. So, I mean, so each of these branches, each of these modes of integrating and projecting into the hippocampus is one of these corresponding branches flowing into the hippocampus. And likewise, each of these major branches flowing out from the cingulate cortex is actually an entire mode of doing, corresponding with different of the cingulate cortex. So now that's the cingulate cortex. So if that's to do with thinking, a region here to do with thinking, that's to do with moving your arms and legs about, that's to do with emotional responses. Now here, this is another kind of doing, but it's not physical and it's not visible. If I asked you to close your eyes and visualize yourself walking down your high street, you're doing something, aren't you? It's not overt, but you're doing something. And if I asked you to remember, you know, what's your birthday, what's your date, you've done something, but internally. But the same principle holds that basically all these doing areas are basically project from the cingulate cortex. So therefore, the projecting out of the entire brain, like if these are like individual strands of axon, this is the entire brain. But the entire brain also, the doing part, the cingulate cortex, in a region called the retrosplenial cortex, will send a massive branch in a part called the Pepez circuit. Will send a massive branch back to the hippocampus. So you see, the entire brain has this kind of flowing in, flowing out, looping back, and all the fractal subsections flowing in, flowing out, looping back, flowing in, flowing out, etc., etc., etc. So you see, physically, it's like Russian dolls. Now there's another powerful way that's like Russian dolls. And I go back to the hierarchy I showed earlier. There's another powerful way that the brain is like Russian dolls. Now, if I was able to decompose the entire prefrontal lobes into this kind of continuous hierarchy, I did it for a reason. Because basically, the hierarchy I showed earlier, basically, you know, these are patches of brain side by side. Conceptually, you can actually conceptualize them as Russian dolls. And the reason why is because picture's worth 1,000 words here. Okay, you all know about computer directories. You know basically there's two ways of expressing them. You can actually express them as a sequence of words, So it's like a string of words side by side. And in Windows or Macintosh, you can have them in folder form. But you also know you can also have them in nested folder form. So even though these parts of the brain are kind of like side by side, conceptually you can actually visualize them as being Russian dolls. So what I propose here is that the emotion centers hierarchy of doing, projecting back to the all the sensory areas, forming another lateral hierarchy, this kind of lateral principle, combined with the containment principle, neurons being contained in columns, contained in hypercolumns, contained in patches, physically contained, combined with this lateral Russian doll conceptualization. Basically, what I've done is I've decomposed the entire brain into one huge Russian doll. So that's the Russian doll of self. Then the first level of sub-Russian doll are context of intent. So I'm the same person, but I'm feeling like an ice cream. I'm the same person, but I'm feeling thirsty, whatever. I'm feeling like, whatever. You're a different person in different minds. So what the idea is basically that you can decompose physically, but also conceptually, the entire human brain as a Russian doll. So you see, it's a very elegant way of looking at the brain. Very simple. Now, I'll further justify my decomposing and kind of integrating the emotion centers with the rest of the prefrontal hierarchy with a simple computer program. I'll show you in a minute. Now, it's a very messy computer program I wrote. Ghastly stuff. I mean, computer program is not my strong point. This is basically called a diffusion limited aggregate. They used to be called slow grows because basically you set the program running. And maybe the next morning you might get half of that, but now computers are, since the 70s when they first discovered, about 1,000 times faster, so they grow fast now. What it is, basically you start off, okay, I should have programmed this better, but you start off with one single point in the middle, yeah? And then you can see these little particles, they're moving around like Brownian motion, just randomly moving about. So I'm just jiggling about randomly, you can see these little particles. Now how it starts, basically you have one particle in the middle, and see one particle, from that one particle in the middle, it starts growing outwards. Okay, so that's what's happening. And basically it's used as a model to understand things like how snowflakes form. So snowflakes will always form from a central point. An impurity, some kind of pollutant, will start the process off. That's why you can seed snow formation and rain cover and stuff like that. Water, when you freeze water, the freezing always starts from an impurity, some kind of pollutant in the water. And if you remove all pollutants in the water, you can supercool it. You can cool it to minus hundreds of degrees and it stays as water. So in the same way, this growth process starts from the middle with this kind of sticky particle. And from that sticky particle, all these random particles stick onto it and it grows. And those sticky particles themselves become sticky and then it grows out. And also like town formation, DLAs are used to model town formation. So you might have a kind of like an outpost by the river and some guy erects a shed. And settlers come, they tend to congregate close, and then you get a town growing outwards. And basically it's also used to model town growth. Now if you move this to the brain, if the central sticky point is basically a basic primary reward, like orgasm or sticky ice cream in your mouth or that can of Coke in your needle in your arm, a basic reward, and then from that you chain, backwardly, you chain the behaviours and the thoughts which led up to that reward. Does that make sense? So in psychology they call this kind of like, pre-Mac principle, higher order conditioning. So basically you have basic rewards you're born with. But let's say hunger, the little baby learns, oh hunger, kind of nipple in the mouth, then mummy, give me milk, and then you get kind of baby food, and baby food comes in the cupboard, it comes in a little jar. So you chain up behaviours that lead to that reward, and then you learn that you have to earn money to buy that baby food. As you progress, you develop this kind of knowledge web. So imagine that every single basic reward in your brain has its own, it's like a sticky particle. As you go through your life, you basically grow these trees of knowledge. You're growing out all the rewards and all the behaviours that lead to those basic primary rewards. You chain it backwards. So it's like a model, not just of how towns form, but and how snowflakes form, but how your entire life, your entire knowledge web forms in your mind. So it makes sense. I mean, basically, you're just saying what psychologists say anyway, but higher order conditioners. Basically, you chain them to higher orders. And sometimes the chain becomes so far removed, we forget what the meaning was. Okay, there's addiction and there's fetish. where the meaning isn't so apparent. But what I'm saying is, the sticky point at the middle is where it begins. Now, the brain theory is fractal in another fascinating way, because that, you see, that's basically, if that's a model of your abstract internal world of all the things you know based on your emotions, then the brain theory is fractal in a fascinating way. It kind of justifies me fractalizing the emotion centers, because, I'll show you why, because basically the knowledge web of your entire brain is essentially the same as a neuron. So everything I reason for my entire knowledge web in the same way that needle in the arm, the orgasm, rewards all the behaviours that led up to that basic reward. A neuron fires, actually all neurons do this, to send a retrograde spike immediately to all the dendrites and all the synapses that made that neuron fire. You see a kind of fractal correspondence between a neuron and an entire sequence of behaviours leading to a reward. So even though the web of knowledge is something in your mind and it's abstract, it's basically expressed over time, it's exactly fractal with a neuron firing, having an orgasm, you know, doing its thing, and then retrogradely sending a signal back to the synapses that made it fire. Then in the more long term, it basically sends nerve growth factor to physically consolidate those synapses. I'm saying the same principle holds. It's kind of fractal on a more abstract level. So there's a further justification for why I fractalize the emotion centers, because everything I reason for the emotion centers, and everything I reason for the emotion centers in relation to our knowledge webs, you know, our emotion centers feeding this knowledge web, effectively feeding the growth of this tree of knowledge in our minds. Everything I reason for that, I can also reason for a neuron, and vice versa. Isn't that a beautiful fractal? Compelling reason why to fractalize the emotion centers in this one concept. We need to take the theory further, so this is what you've seen is basically a lot of analogies and parallels. We need to take the theory goes much, much further. By the end of the talk, we're going to go so far out, you're not going to believe how far this talk's going to go. You know, I'm just wondering, it's a lot of the best is yet to come. This is nothing. I mean, basically, we're going to start talking about consciousness and cosmic things. This is basically preliminary. This is cutting-edge neuroscience. It's basically...
They all want to engage their motor sensory cortexes.
Come back, don't go away. I mean, we talked about an hour now, so basically we're going to take a little break. Yeah. And then I'll stick around to answer questions. But the far-out stuff is still to come. This is pretty far out.
Let's say thanks very much. So I'm going to welcome back Wai. Thank you very much for coming back.
The second part will build on the first part, and then it gets more far out now, because we're going to build on the first part of the talk and take it to interesting places. Now, okay, we need to take it further. To make it into a proper scientific theory, we need a language to code, express these ideas in a kind of more formal language. It's going to have lots of correspondences and analogies and stuff. We need to code it in a kind of formal language to make it into proper scientific theory. Now this language is such a simple thing. It's the most fundamental data structure in all of computer science. It's the simplest concept probably in all the informational sciences. Basically, it's a binary tree. It's so simple. It's so incredibly simple. Like it's fundamental. Now with binary trees, you can represent anything. You can represent things in computers, but you can also represent space and time. So here you've got binary tree, and you got, I've rotated it, and you make binary trees represent little grids. You see that binary tree has made that little grid, and then this is a binary tree making a bigger grid and bigger grid. And if you colour those little squares black or white, you can see you can draw little pictures. And you can actually represent little pictures with binary trees, like a JPEG, like a digital camera. And it's easy to extend the idea to include different colours, different shades, etc. So with binary trees, just like on a computer, and binary language, you can represent anything. And so you can represent spatial things. But you can also use binary trees to represent time. So if you imagine you can use that to draw little pictures, you can link up these little pictures in time. So that's a binary tree but it's actually representing something in sequence. So imagine like a little flip cartoon, like you used to do as school kids. You kind of flip and then kind of do the same kind of principle. But here, this binary tree is representing a sequence expressed over time. That's another variety of binary tree. Now, some of you are thinking that's really contrived. What's that got to do with the brain? I'm going to show you absolutely everything. And when you see these binary trees throughout in psychology, psychophysics, and also the way the brain develops, then you see that this is not just a useful language. It's actually something fundamental to how brains work and how brains come to being. So this is something I can piece together lots of information from different areas now just to show you that binary trees are everywhere in the way the brains work. So sometimes we learn about things, how they work when they go wrong. Okay, so there's a condition called hemi-neglects. It's when a part of your brain called the parietal lobe gets damaged. You lose half your world. Now, this is really baffling because you can't imagine losing half your world. So people with hemi-neglect are basically, if you're asked to imagine walking down the street, then they can recall things only on one side of the street. And, but then if you ask them to walk to the end of the street and turn around in their imagination, then they can recall the stuff on the other side of the street. If you ask them to draw a clock, then they draw the numbers on one side of the clock, etc. Look at a word on the menu, then you see one side of the word. So you can kind of binary bisecting what you're seeing. Now, if they're presented with a plate of food, this really happens. This actually happens. It's really, well, it's tragic, but it's funny. So you get a plate of food, okay, start eating, and then stop. And then you turn the plate round, now you can see it, then start eating, and then stop again. So this is what literally happens. You can see it's kind of binary bisecting the place of food. So you're getting an idea of how the brain organises space. This is a little technical. The brain processes vision as spatial frequencies. Now this is slightly technical. Basically, spatial frequency is like sound waves over space. Now the main point is that your retina and your prime visual cortex processes spatial frequency in octave bands. Now, if I get too technical, the main thing is that if you go up an octave, you're doubling the frequency. So here's, if these are spatial frequency gratings, that's spatial frequency, and that's looking at two spatial frequency gratings. You can see that's twice the frequency of that. Well, anyway, the bands for which the atoms of perception and process are in these kind of binary. You can see doubling the frequency, double the kind of tree structure, doubling the wavelength. Oh, sorry, half the wavelength, or you double the wavelength as you go down octave. Also in music, kind of notes are kind of in this kind of structure that can be rearranged in interesting ways. But the main thing, for our purposes, is that there's something called common time. There's a certain kind of meter and measure to common time music, which is the most popular classical music, but also pop music and folk music. And also nursery rhymes. There's a certain meter where the notes are grouped in powers of 2, 4 beats to a measure, then they're grouped in 8, and then you can see, like, from songs, and into 16. And if you group the other numbers, then it sounds funny. But somehow nursery rhymes, folk music, pop music, common time, classical music has this kind of structuring. And it makes it easy to process somehow. And so doubling gets kind of powers of 2 boxy square structure, and also with an entire song. And also with language, Chomsky broke down all language into binary trees. So say the simple expression, brains think, sentence, noun phrase, verb phrase, brains think, binary tree. A more complex sentence, brains think binary, it also says binary tree, branch, 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 branch. So take that entire sentence and I can fit it into an even bigger sentence, brains think binary, wave thinks brains, that's a binary tree. Okay, so language, music, visual processing, binary trees. Now, because we showed earlier that the architecture of the cerebral cortex is identical, we can extrapolate from music and speech processing and visual processing to the rest of the brain. And also because we are proposing a symmetrical, self-similar fractal architecture, and in the first part of the talk we've gone some lengths to show that that is the case, then we can actually really extrapolate to other forms of processing. Now, the real clincher is this. The real clincher is that brains come into being through binary subdivisioning. You know this because a fertilized egg becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16. That's basically how bodies form. But also, not just ontogenesis, how bodies form, but also neurogenesis. It's how all cells in your bodies form. It's happening in your body right now, billions of times in a second. Cells are dividing to 2. That's how all cells form in your body. including brain cells. So that's how you start out life, and you progress, and that, you become that in your mother's womb, and then you become that, and then you become like a flat disc. You kind of progress, and so you've got billions and billions of cells now. Then you kind of progress, and then the rudimentary brain's developing now. And so dividing in two, dividing in two, dividing in two. Then it kind of curls up into like a little rudimentary brain. That's going to be your spinal cord, and then eventually. You can see in the primitive brain of a four-week-old embryo, the different parts of the brain are already kind of subdividing. So that's what's going to become the frontal lobes, the hippocampus, and the anterior commission. All these different parts are already earmarked to become those parts, even at 4 weeks. And it continues, and then eventually you get a full brain. Now, what this is a flat map. Even though the brain, the cell dividing has a complex 3D structure, the dividing cells that curl up and make complex 3D shapes. If you imagine the cells remain flat, so that's a flat map of a brain. So instead of curling up, if you imagine that all the brains stay flat, then what you have is flat maps. So that's a flat map of your entire brain, and that's a flat map of your hypothalamus, flattened out, neurons flattened out, and that's the proper, what we saw earlier, hypothalamus. Now that is a flat map of your cerebral cortex. Okay, different regions of your cerebral cortex. Now the question is, okay, the big question is, how do different parts of your brain know what to be? And also how different parts of your body know what to be? And how does the brain cell in a certain region know to be that brain cell and knows to be that region? And there's two answers. There's two ways that cells can know what to be. What they're called extrinsic and intrinsic. Extrinsic is basically your environment. It's basically a brain cell knows what to be, what region it's in, because of the kind of hormones and chemicals surrounding it. So that tells it where it's at, what it's supposed to be. The other one, intrinsic, is to do with lineage. Now use a parallel with human beings. You are who you are through your extrinsic conditioning, your surroundings, and what you learn through life. But you're also who you are through your intrinsic genes, your lineage. So a parallel is with brain cells and cells in your body, lineage and intrinsic and extrinsic context. Now, it's very hard to imagine how you can specify all these precise regions of hypothalamus using chemical signals. Because the problem is, how do you stop those chemical signals from leaking to the neighbouring area? And then, if you're using chemical signals or extrinsic indicators to specify brain regions, then how do you mark out those regions in the first place? Well, it's very hard, it's practically impossible. There's a very simple way of actually specifying regions, and that's through intrinsic factors. And because intrinsic lineage is binary, we know that because cells divide in a binary way, there's a very easy way of specifying the entire brain and every cell in your body through using a binary language. Now, a computer program I wrote to illustrate this idea is this. Okay. Now, sometimes if you try to be too technical, you can run into trouble. So there's a computer program somewhere. That's right here, look. That's right here. That's it. And so, okay, this program is used to illustrate this idea. Now, can you see that even though this is a flat grid, can you see that's a binary tree? If I just follow the laser, look, that's the main branch. From there, it's branching to 2. Can you see that? Branching to 2. And then from there, it's branching to 2. It's fractal, so it keeps branching to 2. So that's a binary tree drawn in a way that squeezes onto a flat 2D grid. So you can see, so that's a binary tree, branching, branching, branching. Now, here's a kind of diagram to show another view of that, just to make sure you can see it, make sure you can see. So here's a binary tree, and it's making grids. It's basically branching, branching, branching. So that's drawn like a binary tree. But can you see that that is exactly equivalent to this sort of program, which is this? There you go. It's right here. Okay, so basically, what we're doing now is basically, the program's written in such a way, if I touch any node, if I touch that master node there, do you see the entire subdivisions branching? If I just click on it, then every node that's below it gets marked in a darker colour. Now if I click that node there, then every node there below it the lineage is marked in a darker colour. So that node there is the absolute mother node. That's where it all comes from, and it keeps subdividing. And what's below it is its children. It's kind of children node. And I can click randomly anywhere, and I'm kind of marking different regions. So I can mark this region here, and all the children below there get marked out, all the ones below there get marked out, all the ones there get marked out, etc., etc., etc. I can specify lineage, I can specify patterns. Now here's what I did earlier, aping the old blue piece idea. Here's what I did earlier, you see. So I've done the same thing. Like in one drain, I've created these pretty patterns. In fact, I can create any pattern with this lineage marking out. That's me doing it by hand. What I'm saying is, with genes and with this binary subdivisioning, you can mark out any pattern, but you can also mark out brain regions. Now that's done in a symmetrical way, and to make it graphic, if I just put those flat maps side by side with this digitized map, can you see how these brain regions have been specified by clicking the mouse? Corresponds with how we can specify exactly brain regions in real brains. And because of cell dividing, binary cell dividing, that binary code and binary specification is through lineage, but also has this kind of square, gritty structure. So effectively, I can take every neuron, every region in the brain, I can digitize it, I can specify it using this binary, gritty language. So effectively, I can digitize the physical structures of the brain, and using this language, I can specify relationships between different structures of the brain. So this is really important because we need to specify and quite precise patterns of wiring. Now we go back to that recent result which I introduced earlier, published just this year, 30th of March in Science magazine, one of the most prestigious science magazines in the world. And basically, this gritty way of looking at things, binary trees, corresponds exactly with that gritty kind of perpendicular wiring scheme that they're found in real brains. There's a relationship between this kind of perpendicular grid system and this binary mapping system that makes for very efficient wiring. So almost if this new finding goes hand in hand with a binary mapping language. With this binary mapping language, you can specify precisely regions of the brain, and you can also specify that certain regions will wire up with other regions, and that these wires will be can only go across, up or down. That's really, really efficient. And it's an explanation for why the wiring pattern that they found in this very cutting-edge result that was only published in March this year is the case. So once we have this binary language that is found in vision, music, all through the brain and how the brain develops, then we can basically digitize the entire brain. So and I saw some of you thinking, oh, your theory is so square. I mean, that's really, it's not very hip, is it? I mean, but square things can handle any other geometric form. I mean, say that's hexagons. And you've got hippocampal place cells, which are hexagonal, but the mathematics of the eye, there's a mapping between square grids and hexagons. And also, your language might seem inflexible. It's kind of square. But the language is literally flexible because the actual brain theory uses this binary language, but it does it in such a way that you can actually specify and describe flexible geometric forms. So say this grid here, you're kind of looking down, you're kind of looking across on a binary tree, specifying these kind of grids. So that's a binary tree, and these kind of grids are stacked on one on top of another. Now, this computer program here shows the same thing as that, but what it does, you're looking down on that same grid. So you're looking down on it. So I draw in the grid. So it's the same thing, but I'm looking down on these kind of grids, kind of layered one on top of another. The actual brain theory actually takes these square grids and actually applies transformations on these grids. So just to make it really seasick, I mean, what it means is that basically even though it's a gritty square language, you can actually use it as a base for transforming things. And also then you can describe kind of more complex geometric forms. So In the same way earlier on, we showed kind of self-similarity and symmetry, with the same basic shape being shifted, scaled, and rotated. Because it's a fractal brain theory, what I'm doing is basically exactly those transformations into the square grid. Now, your square fractal brain language has a more organic feel. In terms of artificial intelligence, if you're going to get your program to recognize distorted speech, distorted images, that's part of the brain theory, the transformational part. So just some people might see square grids as being kind of limited, but it's actually totally flexible, literally flexible. Okay. Just to support the using binary trees and grids to map the brain. Yeah, stop me from being seasick. I'll just close this down. I mean, it's a really. Anyways, what's going to do now? Okay, oh yeah, okay. And then with this binary language, I mean, say digitized brain. I mean, say okay. So imagine I've digitized the entire brain, and say that here might be the hypothalamus. That's already kind of cerebral cortex. That might be a digitized. Like this bit, the hypothalamus, you know, flat grid hypothalamus. So all that hypothalamus might be corresponding to what I've kind of digitized here, this part here. And now that is basically a representation of the entire brain. Now, with this language, binary tree language, I can use it to also express relationships between those different parts. So imagine that this binary tree here, representing this grid, is the entire brain. Now, using this mathematical formalism, you do everything in this formalism, so it's a strict language. It's strict, so you can also program it well into a computer. So in this language, this might be a brain region, this might be another brain region. Instead of like wiring it directly across, you may only do a tree walk. You may only go up here, up, down there. Okay, in real brains, it means you're going only like a grid, up, down, or left or right. And likewise, I mean, because it's fractal, each of these brain regions might be, you know, subdivided. And if I wanted to wire up from here to there, again, I do a tree walk. So see what's happening? I'm using a formal language to capture the brain. And it's very easy, straightforward to program into a computer. And when we start talking about artificial intelligence, you'll see the benefits and also some very special properties of this way of looking at things. And it's fractal, you know, I go on and on and on, see, it's fractal. And I can use these things to represent things. Oh, it looks like a swastika, doesn't it? I didn't realise that. So you can represent patterns, you know, let's see, in the real brains, these are bar detectors in the visual cortex. So you can use these grids to represent kind of lines of different orientations. You can actually use it to represent pictures. You see, just graphically, using this binary tree language to digitize the brain, but also represent things using this digital language. And also chaining these things in time. So you're basically digitizing everything that you think, everything you see, everything you can do in a very formal, compact language. Now time, okay, binary trees is also in time, because we talked about music and we talked about language. But the funny thing is, I mean, this is something the scientists weren't thinking about binary trees when they classified brain waves. But also brain waves is also powers of two. Because you've got theta waves, I don't know, is that theta healing? Well, no, theta waves is about 5-6 hertz, and theta waves is what, high up the hierarchy with the cingulate cortex and hippocampus, that's basically works at theta rhythm, so about 5 to 6 hertz. And then alpha waves, they used to think that alpha waves was about relaxation. It's not. Basically, the alpha wave, 10 hertz, is the wave that's used to synchronize the front part of the brain with the back part. So way up the hierarchy, it's 5 hertz. As you go slightly down, looking at front to the back brain, it's 10 hertz. But now when you link up different parts of the brain in the same neighbouring regions in the same part, front or back, then it's beta waves, that's 20 hertz. And then more closer regions, it's gamma waves, prototypically 40 hertz. But you can see, again, powers of 2, 5 to 6, double. Again, this kind of binary patterning in brain waves, in language, and also in music. Okay, slight mental gymnastics. Now these loops I talked about earlier, which are everywhere in the brain, fractally, in neurons looping back, cortical columns looping back, loops with cortical patches through the striatum modulated by dopamine, this ubiquitous patterning in the brain. Surely this serves some really important function. I believe that functioning is representing time. And I can show graphically why that's the case. The brain kind of works at a 40 hertz underlying frequency. And the reason why that is because of a certain inhibitory receptor called a gamma-aminobutyric acid A receptor subtype. And it's the most widely distributed inhibitory receptor in your brain. So it's everywhere, it's all over your brain. And this receptor has a refractory, so it works, it does its thing, it inhibits. Then it needs about 25 milliseconds to rest, then it can inhibit again. So 25 milliseconds, 25 milliseconds, that's 40, 25 milliseconds in a second, so they get a 40 hertz cycle. So inherently, there's a tendency in your brain to work at 40 hertz and superimpose on that as your 20 hertz, 10 hertz, and 5 hertz, and then it's even longer wavelengths of even 1 second, even several seconds. But you see a kind of binary structure going on. We can argue that time is discretized, that we can use binary trees to represent time, because we know that brainwaves do chop up your temporal perception, your flow of time. We know this because theta waves, the hippocampus, a rabbit sniffs at 5 hertz a second. And we know that that 5 hertz sniffing is synchronized with the rabbit's theta wave. So if the signal arrives into the rabbit's brain at the trough of a theta wave, then it doesn't form the memory of the smell. If you synchronize the signals to arrive at the trough, then it doesn't form the memory. If it arrives at the peak, then it does form the memory of the smell. And likewise, in a human visual system, you can synchronize visual percepts with the gamma wave. If you flash frame the stimulus to the troughs of the gamma wave, then the person doesn't see it. So you see, time literally is chopped up and quantized in this kind of like quantum manner. And it fits our binary tree way of looking at things perfectly, because we are exactly quantizing time. Now these loops, if that's a kind of abstract representation of a looping back, now I'll just cut this short because this is kind of like gets slightly convoluted, but the fact of the matter is, if you loop back, okay, if you have a certain state at a certain time t, and you send out a signal at time t, but if you loop back that signal to itself, by the time it loops back, what happens is, this allows that cell or column or entire brain to integrate what happened at time t with what happens at t plus 1. You see, I've taken two time intervals, t and t plus 1, and I've basically I'm able to bind them together as a binary tree. To cut a long story short, this same principle of looping back I can use to temporarily chain kind of sequences of arbitrary infinite complexity. So the proposal is that this looping back is exactly to do with forming temporal sequences. And we know that the striatum is to do with forming temporal sequences. This is something neuroscientists are still grappling with. How does the brain represent time? But it's staring them in the face because these ubiquitous looping back loops must be doing something fundamental. Okay, so just to skip that, it's basically convoluted way of explaining about language. But anyway, okay, we'll start getting far out now. That's the neuroscience lesson. Okay, we're going to go to special properties of the brain theory now. Okay, I missed out. Okay, not only is structure of the brain fractal, but also the process of the brain is fractal. And I'll tell you what those fractal processes are, just to finish off the neuroscience bit. At all levels in your brain, there is competition going on. So chemicals compete to bind at receptors. Synapses compete to form. So two different axons of different neurons will form synapses. Those synapses will compete with one another. They'll literally suppress neighbouring synapses on the same length of dendrite. And then neurons compete with one another for neural growth factor. Really, it's life or death thing. Neurons that get neural growth factor don't survive. And then cell columns will literally suppress their neighbours. In a kind of, you know that if you itch, if you scratch the area surrounding it, you laterally inhibit the itch, rather than scratching directly. That's a universal principle in the brain. And you also know that in your mind, moods compete. Is a glass half empty or is it half full? And you also know that when you make a decision, that is a competition for an entire brain state that can lead to one mode of behaviour or another. And also, when we feed things into your visual cortex, into one eye or the other, what they do is they basically have a special lens. So you feed one image to one eye, one image to the other. Now what you see is not an amalgam of the two images. What you see is basically one or the other. They compete to be perceived. And you also know in your introspection that your attention competes. So, you know, can I listen to that thing or look at that thing? But there's competition processes going on at all levels in the brain, from the microscopic, molecular, right up to decision processes and attentional processes. Now also at all levels of the brain, there is linking up. So along a stretch of dendrite, synapses will link up to form composite representations along a stretch of dendrite. Then dendrites are linked up in a neuron. The neurons link up with each other, cell columns link up with one another, and also brain states link up in time. So microscopic brain states link up in time, and also whole brain states link up with each other and they're sequenced in time. So again, a universal thing. Back to that diffusion limited aggregate growth, that tree, linking up in space and time. So these are fundamental processes that happen in the brain, but also I want to show in a minute that these processes completely extrapolate into society and the universe. There's something very, very simple and beautiful, but also profound about the brain theory. I'm about to show you what it is. Okay, special properties of brain theory. What we have is a fractal reduction, as I've explained in the first part, of all brain structure and process. Okay, and also the simplest, most generic formalism you can possibly use to describe, to capture this brain structure and also brain process, binary trees and combinatorial spaces. And what we have in this fractal reduction of the brain and also binary trees is a way of bridging all the different brain structures in a single language, in a single concept, because it's fractal. And music, vision, language, a single concept bridges all of it and also explains how we demarcate different regions of the brain through binary lineage. Now, it also bridges neuroscience and artificial intelligence and computation science, because binary trees and combinatorial spaces is the language of information science. So you see, there exists in the world today a chasm between psychology, brain sciences, and the world of information science and artificial intelligence. A huge gap exists. There is some crossover, but really all this new data in neuroscience, they can't integrate into the world of artificial intelligence and computer science. Okay, now let's talk about artificial intelligence for a bit. On one level, this language, the three main ways of doing artificial intelligence, neural networks, spatial temporal artificial intelligence, good old-fashioned logical and symbolic AI, and what I call combinatorial AI, which is genetic algorithms. Now, what the language does, binary trees, combinatorial spaces, map to brain structure and brain process, basically provides a common language for explaining all these things. So instead of doing neural nets, basically, like I showed earlier, you're doing a tree walk. So instead of connecting neurons laterally directly, you're basically doing spatial temporal processing through tree walks. And logical symbolic AI is all binary trees. Prolog is binary tree processing. Lisp processing language is called Lisp, even though it's called Lisp processing languages. What we use those lists for is to represent binary trees, generally. And combinatorial AI, basically, we are working directly in the language of combinatorial space using binary trees. So it's a unifying language for basically really making these different systems defunct. Now, artificial intelligence people do mix these different methodologies with varying degrees of success. But what I'm saying is it's a way of actually unifying the brain and unifying all these different approaches in one language. Existing algorithms, existing computer technologies, what the brain theory does. Now, even though some of these technologies, it's not strictly speaking artificial intelligence, data compression is something you use in your MP3 player and also in your DVDs. Now, obviously, your brain is a data compressor. What I think is the case is that this brain theory captures some of the most advanced and also effective methods in computation science and also these algorithms in one brain theory. So that there are techniques in artificial intelligence which are delivering the goods, and I believe the brain theory captures all these different areas in one theory. I mean, what you saw earlier, the shifting, sliding templates is basically what's used in pattern recognition a lot, and the Bayesian analysis is something that is practically every single artificial intelligence technique that's effective uses some sort of Bayesian analysis or is expressible in that way. But this brain theory does Bayesian analysis fractally at every levels. So in the future there will be talks especially about artificial intelligence, and these will be basically about computer code and so it's a little bit recondite. So we basically be going through these algorithms and going through computer code, basically. This is a recurring view in some of the top names in artificial intelligence and also in people working in the singularity. They say the same thing. They say there's going to be no overarching theory. There's no unifying concept. There would never be a master algorithm of artificial intelligence. And these are some of the biggest names in AI, AGI, the director of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology labs for a long time, AI labs. Lewis Nielsen, director of the Stanford Laboratories, AI labs, Danny Hillis. These are all people considered geniuses. But they all say the same thing. What I propose with this fractal reduction is that there is a single language for expressing the entire brain, but also unifying all existing AI. It's a very succinct and very compact description. But what's the real clincher, and this is an absolute stunner, okay, is that the entire brain theory reduces to a single recursive atom. And I think this will stun the world of artificial intelligence. When I made the claim that people would disbelieve at first, but there's actually reasons to suspect that brain theory might reduce to a recursive atom, because the most widely known recursive atom is the fertilized egg. So recursion, the most well-known process of recursion, is a fertilized egg becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes your entire body, but also becomes your brain. Now, there's a stunning result in the brain theory, and so for 5 minutes, it just involved a little mental gymnastics, no equations, but what Michael Barnsley, the fractal mathematician, calls mathematics of the eye. I've used clever diagrams to reveal something fundamental about the brain theory. It's like an E equals MC squared of the brain theory. I'll tell you what it is first before I explain it. Basically, what the brain theory shows is that the entire brain theory reduces to a single recursive atom, like the fertilized egg is a recursive atom. What the brain theory shows is that the process by which brains come into being, ontogenesis, how bodies come into being and how brains come into being, neurogenesis, which is one process, how brains work, how we think, how neurons link up, but also how brains evolve over evolutionary time is actually one process. And there's a staggering claim to make, but which I have to substantiate, and leads to bigger things. I'll show you the little mathematics of the eye, no equations, mathematics of the eye. Now, okay, so 5 minutes is like an appendix of a book, but no equations, just diagrams. Binary combinatorial space, okay, basically what you're using binary strings to represent combinations. And those combinations also represent like flat maps of pictures or animations in time. Now, to go to the simplest case, we got, to make it really simple, a binary tree, branch, 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 branch. Each of those, can you see that each of those squares is a pattern of branching? Now, if 0 means I branch left and 1 means I branch right, and each of those boxes is a pattern of branching down. So I go left, left, 0, 0, left, right becomes 0, 1. These are ordered combinatorial codes you can represent with 2 branchings. Now, if that subdividing is like neurogenesis, that's like the fertilized egg, becoming 2, becoming 4, becoming 8, to infinity, can you see basically each of those virtual neurons that's been created through this virtual neurogenesis process is effectively a combinatorial code. So it's basically a pattern of branching either going left or right. So each of those is a pattern of going left or right that can be expressed with a binary number, in this case 2 digits. Now if I take this idea, instead of going down, okay, this diagram here, I'm actually going across. That's what I've created going down. So each of these boxes is a binary code corresponding to these numbers here. So it's 4 virtual neurons I've created with this virtual neurogenesis process. Now if I go across now, link up these neurons, across, can you see the same thing? That instead of going left and right, each of those boxes can contain a 0 or 1. So with just one neuron, I can represent 2 things, 0 or 1. As I go across, I can represent, like with 2 bits, I can represent 4 things. So here I can represent, like, numbers correspond, I can represent either 0 or 1. Now I can represent 4 things, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as I go across, then I can represent 8 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. When I get right to the end, I can represent 16 things. Now basically, these numbers here are all the combinatorial combinations you can fit into those boxes. Okay, so now if one last step. If I take this process in time, okay, this is almost exactly the same diagram, bing. Except this binary tree here represents past and future. Instead of branching left and right, I'm representing past and future. Now I'm going forwards in time. And at time t, I can either be 0 or 1. And then time t plus 1, either 0 or 1 again. But if I take 4 time intervals, I'm also creating combinatorial codes. In essence, these 3 diagrams capture all the 3 ways I can create binary codes with the brain. First, I physically create the substrate of neurons that represent things. And then I can link these neurons up laterally in time. And then I can chain these combinations, laterally, and then I can chain these combinations in time. But the point is that what you're doing is you're exploring combinatorial space. So therefore, you see the kind of relationship between me linking up patterns across space, linking up, then chaining these patterns in time, and also the process by which brains come into being is actually one continuous process. But also because evolution, gene space, genes which give rise to brains, is also combinatorial codes. There's actually one language that describes evolution on the planet and the universe. Brains coming into being, bodies coming into being, brains linking up sideways, and behaviours chaining in time. There's actually one language that captures them all. Now, okay, the relevance of this it becomes apparent because what we're going to do with the brain theory, we're going to extrapolate the brain theory to the universe. So the proposition is that what's happening in the brain is also happening in society and in the entire universe. That's a huge claim to make, and vice versa. You can interpolate from society and the universe into the brain. So I need to show you how the universe is like Russian dolls. Okay, how the entire universe is fractal now. So back to our Russian dolls again, I need to show you by starting from the obvious and really straightforward and something you can't, very, very intuitive, to something that's less intuitive. Basically show how the universe is Russian dolls. Now, as we described earlier, how bodies come to being is through a process where you start off as an egg, a singularity, a fertilized egg, and those cells divide into 2, into 4, keep dividing and dividing your body right now. But also, these cells, they compete at all levels. Your body produces more cells than it needs, and those cells compete to play their roles. And as these cells divide, they differentiate into certain species and play certain roles in certain brain regions, certain parts, cells in your liver, certain cells in your kidney, etc. So in a sense, there's a kind of controlled evolution within the process of ontogenesis. And then through this process of subdividing, competing, we also know that through bones, skin, sinews, surely you have become one person. So these dividing cells has become one integrated whole. So that's obvious, that's intuitive. We also know that the human race started from a singularity. It could have been actually one breeding pair, literal Adam and Eve, probably in Africa somewhere. And then from this singularity, human race singularity, through the periods, epochs of time, human beings have spread out across the planet, have subdivided, bred, had children, spread and evolved and spread across the entire planet. And there's a process of dividing from the singularity, but also competing, kind of sibling rivalry, intertribal rivalry, racial rivalry, warped nation states, kingdoms, etc. But surely there's been a process of coming together, of these tribes becoming kingdoms, becoming nations, becoming nation blocks. And we are surely coming into this one world global village. Now this is the issue of the age. Is this global village going to become a one world tyranny, or is it going to be something more benign, something more democratic, more representative, more equal? But surely it's undeniable that the human race is surely becoming one jumbo jet internet. We are becoming interlinked like no time ever before into one entity. Through a process of subdividing from a singularity and competing. Now, okay, this is more, even though this is more speculative, this is an idea which is supported from religion, but also technologists and futurists and physicists have the same idea, that the entire universe becomes one entity. That from the Big Bang singularity is a process by which space and time explodes out and divides out into all the universe. And then this cosmic process becomes this cosmic Christ, this celestial Buddha, this universal Vishnu. The entire universe becomes one entity. That one entity becomes conscious and enlightened. Now, it's not just a mystical idea, because people like Ray Kurzweil say the same thing, people like Kevin Kelly, people like the physicist Frank Tippelis. It's also physicists and technologists have the same idea that the entire universe will become as one. But can you see, the same process of subdividing competition and combining into one is a kind of Russian doll structure. The one world order doesn't come in one go. Basically, there's intermittent steps. Basically, tribes become, kingdoms, become nation states, a kind of fractal Russian doll structure. And the same way the universe doesn't become the cosmic Christ in one go. It becomes, human consciousness, planetary consciousness, galactic consciousness, intergalactic consciousness in these graduated steps. But can you see, it's the same underlying structure and process. So what I hope to show there is basically, if that's the cosmic doll of the entire universe, emerging from the singularity to become this cosmic Christ universal Vishnu, and these may be our galactic consciousnesses and planetary consciousness to human consciousness. So say that's a human consciousness there, then you can see that there is a Russian doll structure to the universe. But I go further, because if the brain is a Russian doll, then surely that Russian doll fits in with the cosmic Russian doll, then all existence, all consciousness, all life, all thought, all epistemology becomes one huge cosmic Russian doll. That's a very powerful way of looking at the universe, but it's also a very ancient idea. I'm going to use this idea to, let's get a bit more far out now, to explain the ultimate truth. Far out, it's a good guy for one, isn't it? Really, isn't it? Really. Pay £5, you're going to learn something. You're going to have to pay thousands of pounds over many years in secret societies, pay your dues, learn all the crappy handshakes, and go to these naff meetings. And you may or may not get told the cosmic truth at the end, but you get told for your fiver tonight.
We're all waiting to go to a party where we meet neural scientists, and you'll go, the dendrons and the. And we're like, yes. This is where it's going up.
I'm just going to check the time. I'm going to check the time whether I can skip this or go through it. Run out of time. Well, there's a kind of convergence between existing science with this idea. Basically, there's what I call the new sciences. And this is basically sciences of the fractal, but also sciences of the discrete. You know about quantum mechanics, but now they've also quantized space and time. And also what's called the informational paradigm, and also complexity theory. And Stephen Wolfram's new kind of science deals with cellular automata. There's no time to go through this, but all these cutting-edge paradigms in physics actually converge with the language of this brain theory. So the idea that the brain theory extrapolates to the universe actually goes hand in hand with cutting-edge currents in physics today. So, huge subject, I need about 5-10 minutes to go through, but I want to save time for the ultimate truth. What's the ultimate truth? Basically it's the idea that God is one, and we are one, and that somehow the oneness of God and the oneness that we are is actually one and the same. So when people experience themselves as one with the universe or one with God, and that's not illusion, that's reality. And me in this room looking at you now, that's illusory. And that's been the recurring idea in religion. I know some people have ideas about religion. Let me explain. Religion exists without exception on two layers. This diagram represents the idea that there's exoteric religion. This is the religion we all know and hate. This is esoteric religion. Esoteric means hidden. Now, exoteric religion is churches, synagogues, mosques. It's religious fundamentalism, it's Bible, Quran, etc. These are the outward signs of religion with senseless rules, rituals and regulations. The fantasies, fairy tales and fables promoted as absolute truth. This is basically what we normally understand as religion. Now, the political talk I gave showed that this is really the religion of the popes, Roman emperors and caliphs, the religion of power and domination. It's also the religion that many people understand, because religion is multifaceted, and all these multifacets are not mutually exclusive. So you think religion is open to the people, then it is. If you think religion is a way of controlling people, then it is. If you think religion is astrological things going on in the sky in kind of parable form, then it is those things. It's many things. It's morality, it's poetry, it's law, it's all these things. That's exoteric religion. This is where religion disagrees. This is where there's conflict. This is the religion that will never reconcile with science, the kind of fantasies, the miracle stories. But there's also esoteric religion, which is hidden. Now, esoteric religion is alluded to in this idea of the Christ within, Buddha within, Allah close to you doing a jugular vein. In the Sikh holy text of one God is all-pervading, and alone dwells in the mind. Buddha within, etc. I mean, God is inside you. Also the idea that somehow we are one. In Christ there's no Jew, there's no Greek, and there's no slave. For in Christ we're all one. That in the Quran, God has created you for oneself, and also another passage that your creation and your resurrection is like that of a single soul, undivided and invisible. And also the idea, John Lennon lyric, John Lennon's known as modern Gnostic, the idea that I am he as you are he, and we are all together. Okay. And so somehow we are one, but God is also one. But in the Bhagavad Gita, the super soul appears divided, but is never divided, and is always situated as one. And the ultimate commandment in Judaism, Moses was asked, what's the ultimate commandment? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And in Christianity, Jesus asked, what's the ultimate commandment? Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. So somehow God is one, and that we are one. And that somehow, in the esoteric traditions, that somehow we are God. And when we get to the heart of esoteric religion, we have this idea expressed explicitly in the Sufi, Gnostic, and especially in Tantra in India, and mystical yoga, and also in Kabbalah, the idea explicitly stated that you are God. Some people might be familiar with Muhammad saying, "Whoever knows himself knows God." That's open to debate. But he also says in the mystical Hadith Qudsi, he says, quote, "Man is my mystery, and I am his mystery, for I am he himself, and he is I myself. I am God." It's a favourite Sufi saying. And also in the Gnostic Gospels, which were buried in an urn and discovered in 1945, because all the other Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels, were destroyed by the Catholic Church. So it's lucky that it was buried. Discovered in Nag Hammadi find explicitly, Gospel of Thomas. Jesus explicitly saying, "As I am, you can be also. Drink from my mouth, and you shall be as I, and I shall be as you, and the hidden things that you shall be revealed." So what's going on? This idea that everyone's God that's been hidden through the years. So why is it hidden? Why is it esoteric? Well, two reasons is that one, people who have told this truth have been executed. Massive disincentive to explain the truth, and also the truth has been buried and burned and crucified. But also the other reason, it's been impossible to explain to people. But that has changed, and 2012 is a time for this truth to finally be revealed in a way that can finally be understood by theologians, scientists, mathematicians, everybody, lay people and philosophers. So we are going to now explain how everyone is God, and we're going to use the fractal brain theory to do it. One major thing which stops us from seeing that we're God is the assumption of materialism. And that's all it is, an assumption that there's a physical reality out there on which my consciousness and my brain is based. Now, the opposite idea is idealism. It's the idea that consciousness is primary, that physical universe is illusory. So we see this all religion, Maya, Sannyata in Buddhism, Plato's cave, that somehow reality is illusory. Quantum physicist John Wheeler, who worked with Albert Einstein, said according to quantum mechanics, there's no out there. It's paradoxical, and paradox reveals the cracks in our structures of belief, and this particular belief, materialism, is being undermined from philosophy, science, and in religion. I mean, Descartes, Kant, and Berkeley all came to the same conclusion, and this conclusion has not been challenged by materialist scientists, that we can never know the external world. We can only it's only an assumption, we can only know our consciousness. And our knowledge of the external world is mediated through our knowledge of consciousness. So at the outset, the assumption of consciousness is flawed, because you're basing something on which you do have certain knowledge of, your consciousness, on something you can never have direct knowledge of, and it can only be a guess and an assumption and a belief. Now the trick has always been, how do you show idealism is the case? Now, discoveries have occurred in recent years that actually really make the case for idealism, and one of those discoveries is called the Mandelbrot set, and this is the marvel of fractals. And it's basically 1975. This discovery was made. It's basically it's also a return of ancient ideas, was the idea that fractals we're talking a lot about tonight is also an ancient mystical idea, because in the Upanishads it says, written 5,000 years ago, as is the human body, so is the cosmic body, as is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind, as is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm, and as is the atom, so is the universe. So you see, this idea is really, really ancient. Okay, so that is the Mandelbrot set. Okay, that's the Mandelbrot set. Now, that's the entire Mandelbrot set. This object is infinite. It's basically infinite. The complexity never ends. So that's the overall Mandelbrot set. Now, if I take that little square there and I zoom into it, look, I'll zoom into it. There's more pattern. So I look at that little square there, I zoom into it. There's more pattern. See, I zoom into it. And then, oh, that one up there. And on and on and on. It goes on and on and on. It never ends. There's infinite, absolute complexity in there. And also add, very importantly, that the entire Mandelbrot set is described by this single equation. That compact description contains all that complexity. There's no smoke, there's no mirrors, there's nothing random going on. The trick why it was never discovered before is it's a recursive function. You have to do thousands and thousands and thousands of calculations to get one pixel of the Mandelbrot set. Now this is, I'll talk through this walkthrough of the Mandelbrot set. So this is an animation of the Mandelbrot set, just to show you the beauty and the sheer complexity of the Mandelbrot set. Now the question is, okay, the Mandelbrot set, infinite beauty, infinite complexity. Now the question is, now before this Mandelbrot set was discovered, where did it exist? Now, was this Mandelbrot set discovered or was it invented? Surely Mandelbrot didn't invent all this pattern and form, he must have discovered it. So before this was discovered, where did it exist? Now the answer is, it exists platonically or mathematically. Now this is a very ancient idea of Platonic existence, of Pythagoras, the guy who really came out, the universe is a number. And it's a recurring idea of mathematical existence, that somehow the universe exists mathematically. Pythagoras, the universe is a number. Galileo says that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Newton, God is a mathematician. Eugene Wigner, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in describing the physical world. Now the simple proposition is that physical reality exists in the same form that the Mandelbrot set exists. In the same way that you can use computers to make these renderings or fly through Mandelbrot sets, what we do as God is that we use this equation of the universe that describes the universe to create subjective experience. Now this idea that the entire universe is one equation is a very ancient idea. In fact, it's in the Bible, because Pythagoras, who said that the universe was number, influenced people like Socrates and Plato. And Plato became Neoplatonism, which found its way in the St. John Gospel, the famous line, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word is God. Through the Word, all things were made. Without the Word, nothing was made that has been made." So there's a lineage of ideas from Pythagoras, Plato, Platonic existence, to Logos in the Bible. And also Paul Davies, the physicist, talks about this equation of the universe that's the end of science, that doesn't just contain the differential equations of the universe, but also the initial conditions of this universe and all universes. So it's basically the illusory universe. The fact that you see that table there, it looks real, but it's illusory. What's behind it is mathematics. This mathematical equation doesn't just contain this universe creating these subjective experiences on this planet in this physical body, but contains all universes and all possible existence. And that is the end of science. So this is a way of explaining the illusory physical universe. Now this idea combines with the fractal brain theory, and also combines with another universal truth in esoteric religion, which is reincarnation. Gnostics believe in reincarnations, Freemasons believe in reincarnation, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism of course, but also in mystical Islam, the Sufis believe in reincarnation. Okay, so this idea combined with the fractal brain, combined with mathematical universe, come together now to explain how we're God. Okay, this is the diagram I used to help that explanation. And it's quite shocking because it actually shows that how you're God. This diagram here comes from Roger Penrose's book. So leading physicists describe three realms: the mental world of subjectivity and consciousness, the physical world that's out there, and a kind of platonical mathematical universe. of ideas in Mandelbrot sets. Now, the simple proposition is basically the physical world doesn't exist. But what exists is the mental world of the one consciousness and the logos, the equation of God, that generates subjective experience. Now, there's two ways of looking at the universe. There's what's called block universe, the universe as scientists understand it. And there's another way of looking at the universe, which is completely subjective, that all existence is consciousness. And but block universe describes the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe. Okay, space-time, the entire cosmic cycle in one go, and that's physical existence. So, and each of these kind of blobs is one of the Russian dolls. That's the big Russian doll. And that might be a galactic consciousness, that might be a planetary consciousness. And every single consciousness is one of these red splodges. So every single consciousness from the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe is one of these red dots. So that's a physical block world description of the universe with the consciousnesses mapped out in physical space-time. There's another way of looking at the universe which holds that there's only one consciousness to begin with, and there's logos. So this other way of looking at the universe is a single thread of existence, of the one consciousness, the undivided, indivisible soul of God. And every single conscious being, every single bead in this block universe from beginning to end is like beads on a necklace on a single thread of consciousness. So that each of these points on this very long chain of transmigration, if each of those points experiences itself as God and experiences itself as the entire universe, then it's not actually illusory, it's actually real. That it's this view of the universe which is really illusory, and that this view is really what's the shocking esoteric view that's been waiting to be explained for thousands of years. And we can do this because we have the fractal brain theory to show that there's an idea in artificial intelligence called organisational invariance. The same organisational structures should give rise to the same consciousness. Because we have a fractal brain theory, and we know our own consciousness, and because the fractal brain theory extrapolates the entire universe, then it makes sense that our consciousness has a relationship to all those other consciousnesses, because it's all symmetrical and self-similar and fractal. So therefore, that's another kind of reason why we can make this complete decomposition of the entire universe, all fractal consciousnesses, all the Russian dolls, and string them out into one consciousness. And that's the reason why everyone's God. No. Now, I've kind of described something extreme. I'm not trying to start a cult, I'm trying to start a revolutionary social movement. That's the extreme case. But you can water down this case to have other versions of mysticism, pantheism, qualified non-dualism. You see, once you explain it for the hardest case, you also pave the way for other forms of mysticism. So even though I believe in this, believe that, basically I'm God and this universe of illusion, you are too, you're God as well. That's what I believe, this is absolute monism. This explanation also supports other varieties of mysticism and spirituality. So basically revives mystical traditions for the 21st century. And also explains the nature of consciousness that's not reducing to physical matter, but that idealism is the truth. It's a funny thing, materialists think that their way is the only way, but really the fact that materialists in academia are dominant is a quirk of history. Because quite simply, if Germany won the war, because continental philosophy tends to be existential, phenomenological, and idealistic. All the great German philosophers were idealists. Then basically, academic philosophy would be idealist. So it's just another viewpoint that has never found its way of actually, okay, if Germany won the war, I wouldn't be here right now, and Hitler moustaches would be fashionable, organic food, and you'll be speaking German. Okay. But idealism would be the dominant ideology. So basically, it's a quirk of history. What we're trying to do here is actually revive idealism. Okay, so we can explain the hardest case in order to revive other forms of spirituality and other forms of mysticism. Anyway, okay, so what we've effectively done, okay, one last thing, because, I'm going to tie up the talk now, it's always come to an end, it was talk longer than expected. I need to tie up this talk with the revolutionary social movements talk. Now, people who haven't seen that talk, I recommend it because it's basically all about revolutionary social movements. But the proposition is that if you revive esoteric religion and you revive the apocalypse archetype, that some of the biggest revolutionary movements, the most effective revolutionary movements of the past 1,000 years. That's what's really behind them. That's an amazing claim, but I mean, it's actually fact that the apocalypse archetype and the esoteric religion is behind all these revolutionary movements. Now, what I've done so far is revive the esoteric truth that, you know, we're God. What I need to do now is revive the apocalypse archetype, just to finish off the talk, to link up this talk with the other talk, apocalypse archetype, esoteric religion, and revolutionary movements. Okay, there's another idea in mysticism of the cosmic battle between good and evil. Now, I want to do a sweeping unification here, because we have this fractal brain theory and this idea that all is one, that the universe is one, and that there's a single theory, a brain theory, and a single cosmic Russian doll, and a single cosmic process that describes all of it. Now, what I propose is that all these separate things are actually the same thing. Now, let me go through this quickly. Okay, brain theory, competition everywhere in the fractal hierarchy, which I described earlier. And the brain is a cosmic theory. The Russian doll extrapolates to the universe, society, and vice versa. And that we've just shown that the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of God are one and the same, is one and the same. Okay, we've this kind of established there's a kind of unity between kind of cosmic brain theory and consciousness. Surely that means these mystical ideas of the cosmic battle in Zoroastrianism between Ormazid and Ahriman, this idea of a Manichaean struggle between good and evil in Gnosticism or Gnostic sect. Satan, adversary, means adversary. Diablo, the Greek rendering of the word Satan, also means adversary. Dialectic, Hegel's dialectic, it's kind of interplay between synthesis, antithesis, and then a kind of war between thesis, synthesis, makes the synthesis, and the cosmic battle kind of going on, you know, kind of conflict and strife and competition. And also jihad, okay, I better qualify this before I get arrested and black ops taken away by black helicopters. Okay, jihad, okay, jihad means struggle, and okay, Muhammad one time came back from the last battle that established the Muslim community. He said, we've returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad. And that means that the return from the pitched battlefield to the greater jihad, which is to create a better society. Most Muslim scholars agree on that. Muslim fundamentalists have revised the traditional view and said the lesser jihad, war, conflict, weapons, is the only jihad there is. Muhammad also said the perfection of character is the most excellent jihad. You see, it's fractal, going on in your minds and society, between societies and etc. And shaitan means the one who rebels in Islam, and the interplay of polar opposites in Taoism. Surely there must be a connection between all these different processes, and also the idea that evolution and competition and survival of the fittest, that's also touted as a cosmic theory. Even though I really promote the idea that symbiosis, cooperation and synergy is a side of evolutionary theory that's been de-emphasized, that needs to be balanced back into the equation. There is competition going on in evolutionary theory. Nature is red in tooth and claw. There is sibling rivalry. And scientists are using evolutionary theory as this kind of master theory. Some scientists even say evolutionary theory gives rise to the laws of logic. Some scientists even say evolutionary theory gives rise to the laws of physics. That's a certain form of idolatry, isn't it? Evolution has become their god. I mean, really seriously, I mean, it's like, you know, I mean, like, evolutionary theory is the way to truth. Nothing comes to the truth but through evolutionary theory. That's literally what they're saying, in a sense. Now, what I'm saying is, basically, what I'm saying is if this is cosmic theory, what I'm saying is that all these different views on things, but also the apocalypse archetype happening on the planetary scale, but also the mythic archetype. Think about it, myths, the mythic quest hero on a spiritual journey, happening in the Iliad of a battle between societies, in Mahabharata, in Star Wars, I mean, in Dune, a kind of personal journey, a kind of societal battle, but also a cosmic battle going on to create the universe, these cosmic myths. Surely that's fractal, the same thing going on. And the apocalypse archetype is really about this kind of battle going on for a better society, that the new heaven and a new earth. What I'm saying is basically all these things are really talking about the same thing. And if we have a fractal theory of the universe and a unifying fractal theory with the idea that everyone's God, surely it's obvious that this is the case, and you can make a compelling way of actually introducing this back into mainstream society. The main thing is, for the point of linking this with the other talk, is that we revive the apocalypse and prophetic and mythic archetype for the 21st century. We say that Star Wars, Dune, Lord of the Rings and Matrix is actually about what's happening on this planet right now. You ground it in the fractal brain theory and the new cosmology and the new metaphysics. Just to finish off the talk, If there's one thing you could take away from this talk, is that the most cutting edge of science in the brain theory, the most high-tech of high-tech, the bleeding edge of high technology in the form of artificial intelligence and technological singularity, is the complete return of the ancient mysteries. Isn't that a compelling, powerful ending to this 26,000 year cycle that's going to end this year 2012? If this can occur, doesn't that fit the bill? If people are waiting for some dramatic, grand revelation, isn't that something that Dan Brown could even think about? But if you can actually manifest it in real life, it's like the most absurd Hollywood script. But I'm saying this is actually real. You can actually manifest this on the planet. I'm saying this can be sold as a 2012 revelation to kickstart a world revolution. Can I stop it there? Thank you very much.